So there's an issue going on in Oregon with, as it's been called, a armed siege of a wildlife refuge. There are a lot of liberals out there wanting to call this a terrorist action, armed militia. I've seen it labeled. Armed protesters, who police say are coming from outside the area, took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge south of Burns, Oregon on Saturday after participating in a peaceful rally over a prison sentences of local ranchers Dwight and Stephen Hammond. Now, folks, this is a long story of the buildup of all of this, how everything got started. But this is another fight between ranchers and the Bureau of Land Management. In the morning brief today, I linked to a couple of stories. One of them has the headline, "The Full Story of What's Going On in Oregon. Militia Takeover of Wildlife Refuge and Protest to Hammond Family Persecution." And it gives a detailed historic overview of what's going on. And including when the Harney Basin, where the Hammond Ranch is established, was settled in the 1870s. Starting in 1908, this family and other ranchers basically have been in a fight with the federal government. Now, here's where the Bundy family and others got involved. The Hammonds, according to Fox News, I've seen other outlets who say that they were convicted of terrorism. The Hammonds were convicted of arson 3 years ago for fires that burned on federal land in 2001 and in 2006. Now, from what I've read, back in 2001, the Hammond family had contacted local authorities saying, hey, we need to do a controlled burn, as ranchers often do. The fire did get out of control and it spread on the federal land. The feds said absolutely nothing about it. In 2006, there were some bad storms in the area, and lightning started a fire on federal and on private land. The Hammonds set a backfire, which also spread onto federal lands, but it cut out the wildfire that was going on. Federal government stepped in and, according to a few stories I've seen, accused them of basically terrorism for setting fires. So the Hammonds were convicted of either arson or terrorism 3 years ago for fires that burned on federal land in 2001 and in 2006. They served their original sentences for the conviction. Dwight served 3 months. Stephen served 1 year. However, in October of this year, an appellate judge came in and ruled that the terms were too short under the federal law and ordered them back to prison for 4 years each. Now, the back and forth, as I said, started in 1908. And it has to deal with mineral rights. And it has to deal with land being taken away from this family and other ranchers. It goes back to grazing fees. You remember that this has all been in the news before. But where the government comes in and they seize land for a wildlife refuge, and they say that grazing is somehow hurting birds. And so this family has been in a fight with the federal government since the early 1900s. Literally, the early 1900s. It's been a long fight. And so it appears to me that finally people have just had enough. And now that the federal government came back and said, oh, okay, you served your original prison sentence. 4 months and for someone else for a year. All was good until the Bureau of Land Management got involved again and went to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and said, no, we want them to go back to prison for even longer. And so I'm sort of giving you a nutshell version of it, because it's not as cut and dry, at least the history of this, as some in the media would present it. A bunch of ranchers just got ticked off at the government one day and went and took over this refuge. From what I was reading yesterday, Jody, you know how they gained access to this building? Which was being called a federal facility, okay? It's a wildlife refuge. They found keys to the building, and they just let themselves in. No shots have been fired. They are not holding any hostages, but they are vowing not to leave. Ted Cruz, he's one of the first presidential candidates to speak out on this. He said earlier, according to the Des Moines Register, that he hopes this can be this can be ended peacefully. And that, let me get the full quote here. Cruz says that no one should use or threaten force to protest the government. And I'm not necessarily in favor of what these ranchers are doing. But in a way, I see where they're coming from. That they've been pushed around so far. You know, you can only push some people so far. And if nothing else, they are absolutely drawing attention to this. And they're ready to go to jail for it. Some of them are ready, they say, to die for this issue. And at least they want it out there in the media, and people are starting to talk about it. And so I don't think it's as cut and dry as some are presenting out there. You're not going to win by taking up arms. You're not going to win by occupying a federal facility. You're certainly getting your story out there, though. And whoever is in there, now I've seen some numbers that say 100, 150. There were reporters yesterday saying, yeah, we saw about 20 or 30 people. You know, how it's been presented in the media is this huge takeover of an armed militia that busted into this building. They used keys to get in. And they're driving. There were no authorities there as of 3 p.m. yesterday. This story broke, on Saturday? There were no authorities there yesterday at 3 p.m. And these evil armed militiamen were changing the tire of of a reporter who had a flat tire. They're so evil. Watch as this story develops. I think it's an interesting story. I don't think they're going to win at the end of the day, but they're certainly bringing up a fight between ranchers and the Bureau of Land Management and the federal government. And you know, how would you react when if the federal government came in and took all your mineral rights away and all your land away and said you had to go back to jail for 4 years after already serving your sentence of 4 months?